the folksy friend, and on this channel I like to talk about stories. In particular, folk tales, beliefs, and mythologies. On Tuesdays, we talk about Tolkien, and today is Tuesday. So let's go. Valinor, the blessed realm of endless joy and light, has gone dark. The great spider terror Ungoliant, under the direction of Melkor, has literally sucked the life from the two trees, causing them to wither and die. She and Melkor had then fled successfully across the north, and all of those who were atop Taniquetil attending a banquet with Manwë and Varda could only watch in horror as their home was plunged into darkness. Now it took some time, but eventually those who had been at the festival made their way down the mountain and to the Ring of Doom, the throne circle of the Valar. The stars above now shone down as light the same way that it had in Middle-earth for thousands of years, and Manwë's winds had blown away the bad, polluted, dark air. Yavanna went to the trees and tried to touch them, but the branches she touched on each fell away, lifeless. The elves immediately began sounds of grief and mourning, but Yavanna stopped them. She said that even though the trees themselves were gone, their light still existed. It had been preserved within the light of the Silmarils. That it was a wonder Feanor had the foresight to create something to preserve it. Then she explained to the crowd that no matter how powerful a being was, be it elf or Valar, there were some things that they could only ever create once. For her, the creation of the trees had been one of those things. She would never be able to recreate them the same way. But if she could take some of their still existing light, she could use that to breathe life back into the trees before their roots rotted away and all hope was truly lost. So Manwë turned to Feanor and asked him if he would grant Yavanna's request, hand over the Silmarils. There was a long silence. Remember, Feanor had become almost obsessively possessive of the Silmarils at this point. Tulkas lost his patience, demanding to know what Feanor would answer, and in his haste, rather flippantly reminded Feanor that it was Yavanna's creation of the trees that had made the light to inspire the Silmarils. So in a way, his creation was based on hers, implying that he really had no right to keep them. Aule broke in then, probably understanding Feanor more than anyone else there, and he told Tulkas not to be hasty, that they were asking a lot of Feanor, but it was too late. Tulkas's outburst had aroused anger within Feanor. Feanor's voice was bitter as he told the Valar that, similarly to what Yavanna had said, there were some things that someone could only ever create once. For him, that was the Silmarils. He cried out, "If I must break them, I shall break my heart, and I shall be slain, the first of all the Eldar in Aman." Then Mondo spoke and said, "Not the first." But no one knew what he meant, so they just ignored him. Everyone was quiet after that, and Feanor could not help but remember what Melkor had last told him, that the Silmarils would never be safe in any land that the Valar ruled. Now it really seemed to him that he had been right, and that the Valar were thieves. So Feanor looked at them and said that he would never hand over the Silmarils of his own free will. He would only hand them over if he was forced, and if they forced him to do this, they were no better than Melkor himself. Nienna went to the hill and she wept, her tears clearing away the poison of Ungoliant. Then she began to sing in mourning, and just as she did, messengers arrived from Formenos with terrible news. They told everyone that darkness had flooded the land and filled it with horror, and that all those but Finwë had fled before it. So Finwë alone was still at Formenos when Melkor arrived. And there he slew Finwë, king of the Noldor, before his doors, and spilled the first blood in the Blessed Realm. After killing the king, Melkor had burst into the vaults and taken every single gem, including, of course, the Silmarils. At hearing this news, Feanor cursed Melkor, naming him Morgoth, the black foe of the world. And from that moment on, that was how he was known. But then Feanor went further, cursing Manwe for summoning him to Taniquetil, thinking in that moment of madness and grief that if he had been at Formenos, he could have done something to save his father. And with those angry words, Feanor took off. His father was so much more important to him than planning the future of Valinor. Then Yavanna knelt on the hill beside Nienna and cried, fearing that all light was gone from Valinor forever. While those in Valinor mourned their losses, Melkor and Ungoliant had made it back into Middle-earth. Ungoliant's darkness had been covering them, and now she was watching him very closely. They were getting close to the ruin of Angband, and she was afraid that he was going to try to give her the slip, which he was. See, Ungoliant was still hungry despite her gorging herself with the sap of the trees, and she wanted what Melkor had promised, so that's what she demanded. He asked her what on earth she could possibly still want after what had happened, and she demanded the gems from Formenos. Grudgingly, one by one, he fed her the beautiful gems, watching their light disappear. Ungoliant devoured them all, but grew hungrier and darker with each one, until she finally demanded the full promise he had made. "With one hand thou givest," she said, "with the left only. Open thy right hand." In his right hand were the Silmarils. They were locked in a crystal box, but even then they had begun to burn his hand. Despite that pain, and despite Ungoliant's demands, he refused to open his hand. He told her that she had had enough. She was owed nothing more, and that their partnership, as it were, was over. What he was holding in that right hand was his. It was his right to have it, and she could not even look at it. Of course, Melkor was never going to surrender the Silmarils, but Ungoliant could care less what he wanted. She had grown enormous with all the light that she had consumed, and Melkor himself had grown weaker, expanding power while he was in Valinor. So he couldn't fight her off when she surrounded him in a web of darkness, pinning him to the mountainside and strangling him with the gloom. In that moment, he let out a cry so thunderous and terrible that it shook the very mountains around them. The cry echoed through the land, becoming part of it. And from that moment on, anyone who let out a cry in that part of the world would awaken the cry of Morgoth and hear it echo. The sound delved deep into the ground, into the darkest caverns and pits of Angband. And down in that darkness, his followers heard his cry. Balrog surged up out of the ruined fortress and went running to their master. Using their whips of flame, they freed him from Ungoliant, who immediately backed up and began to belch forth more of those lovely vapors to hide herself as she then fled to the south. She went into Beleriand, into the realm of King Thingol and Queen Melian, but she was kept at bay by Melian's power, and so she settled into a valley beneath the mountains of Darthonion. That part of the mountains became known as Ered Gorgoroth, the Mountains of Terror. There, life and light were strangled, and all waters were poisoned. There had already been evil spiders kind of nesting in that area from times of the past, and Ungoliant mated with them, then devoured them, hatching her own little brood of spiderlings, and those spiders infested the valley around them. Ungoliant herself was never heard from or seen again. Some legends say that in her utmost famished desperation, she consumed herself. Back in the north, the Balrogs took Morgoth to Angband, and his followers began to flock to him. He raised up 3 great mountain peaks behind the gates and named them Thangorodrim. Then he got to work, delving, carving, blasting out new caverns and halls and dungeons, making this his new stronghold in Middle-earth. There countless became the hosts of his beasts and his demons, and the race of orcs, bred long before, grew and multiplied in the bowels of the earth. In Angband, Morgoth created for himself a great crown of iron and set the 3 Silmarils into it. It caused him great suffering and weariness to wear the crown, but he never took it off. With this, he named himself King of the World, and he sat to stew in his hatred. The strain from his crown and the pain of his burned hands from holding the Silmarils never truly left him, and he stayed in the dark, stewing over his ever-growing hatred. He intended to stay within the safety of his walls, using his dark spirit to inspire and strengthen his minions to go out and do his bidding for him. He was still mighty and majestic, just like the Valar, but the strength of that power was all turned to darkness. Only the mightiest can even look at him without being overwhelmed by terror. Once he was all situated, crown on head, Morgoth wasted no time fulfilling his desire for bloodshed and violence. He sent orcs under the cover of his darkness into Beleriand to attack the elves. Silently they surrounded from the north, then surged in without warning. Thingol's kingdom was full of many different groups of elves, all kind of spread out throughout Beleriand and Osiriand. The only places that had large established communities was his home, the underground palace of Menegroth, and Eglarest, the walled havens on the coast where the mariners were, led by Círdan the shipwright. Menegroth was surrounded immediately, and Thingol was cut off from his people on the coast. The orcs brought with them utter havoc and devastation. Thingol immediately sent word to the Nandor that were living in Osiriand and called for them to rise up and join him and destroy the orcs in the eastern part of his kingdom. So Thingol led his host from Menegroth, Denethor led his host from Osiriand, and so began the first battle in the many wars of Beleriand. The Nandor's weapons were no match for the orcs, and they took on heavy losses. Denethor and his closest family were surrounded and cut off from the rest of their forces, becoming trapped on the hill of Aman-Areb. There they were all killed before Thingol could get to them. Bitterly, though, his fall was avenged when Thingol came upon the rear of the orcs and slew them in heaps. The battle in the east was successful. Most of the orcs were killed, and very few managed to flee to the north. Even then, many of those were killed by the dwarves of Mount Dolmed. Very, very few survivors actually made it back to Angband. Some of the surviving Nandor went back to their homes in Osiriand, but many went back to Menegroth with Thingol. Those who stayed in Osiriand developed a deep fear of open warfare and never fought in any major conflicts again. They became a very secretive and withdrawn people, and in time they were known as the Lequendi, the Green Elves, because that was the color of their clothing. When Thingol returned to Menegroth, he learned that the battle to the west had been lost. The orcs drove Círdan back behind the walled havens on the Falas, so the only thing Thingol could do now was bring his people into the forests that surrounded Menegroth. He called for all that he could to enter the forests of Neldoreth and Region, and Melian set out to use her power to protect them. She created a wall around the forest made of shadow and bewilderment. No one could cross it into Thingol's lands without either his or her permission. It was named the Girdle of Melian, and the land within called Doriath, the Guarded Kingdom. Within Doriath, it was safe, relatively peaceful. There was also a pocket of safety on the coasts within the walled cities, but everywhere else in the west of Middle-earth was full of danger. The servants of Morgoth went wherever they pleased, and terror went with them. So join me next week when I talk about the aftermath on the side of Valinor. What exactly is Feanor going to do now that his father is dead, his beloved Silmarils have been stolen, and he is full of grief and righteous anger? And with that dangerous cocktail of emotions will mean for his people. We'll see if he makes any good choices. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please leave me a like. Let me know what you think in the comments. I'm so curious to hear what people think about Ungoliant. I think she is just a fascinating character that I wish we saw more of, because it seems like she chose the form of a spider and then ate herself. I don't know, it's just interesting. Either way, I hope you enjoyed this, and I'll see you next week.